Hello and welcome to this month's episode of the VCL Vintners podcast. This month we're super excited to be joined by the esteemed Charlie MacLean, whiskey writer and whiskey expert extraordinaire. Charlie, welcome to the podcast.
You're too kind. Thank you very much.
It's so lovely to have you here.
It's always a joy to be with you, Alwynne.
It's so nice to see you and looking forward to chatting through everything whiskey today.
Absolutely.
Obviously, I know you well. Many people in the world know you well, but for anyone who doesn't, which shame on them, in my personal opinion, but if they don't know you, can you maybe explain to our listeners a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what your background in whiskey is?
I'm sure you've done your research and probably can do a better job than I. Oh, Lord. Well, I spent most of the 1970s trying to think what in hell I was going to be doing, want to do. I did a degree in art history, then I did a degree in law, then I did a law apprenticeship in articles in Edinburgh, and soon realised that the law was not for me, to my father's dismay. While I was doing my articles, I set up my place as a literary agent. I was always interested in books, and there was no literary agency in Scotland. And my colleague in that was a university lecturer in Edinburgh University who is a very dear friend and is now a very, very famous writer called, Sir Alexander McCall Smith. And so Sandy and I set up this, and I suppose it'd been we set it up in 1977, and by 1978 I'd finished qualified, and an author turned up who we thought would make our fortunes, but of course didn't. And so then I did a bit of ghostwriting. Publishers would phone up and say, "Do you have any authors on your books who could help so and so to write a book about such and such?" And by this time I had a business partner. We said, "Well, we'll do it." You know? Yeah. And the first book actually we did was a biography of Hercules the Bear, which had gone AWOL in Benbecula and sometime anyway. And then the most significant thing was, so the agency was running, the ghostwriting was running, and by the early 80s I was writing under my own name, words for cash, little books and things, Scottish non-fiction. But the significant thing was that in 1980, I would guess about 81, a first cousin of mine who was in that, he spent his whole life in advertising in London as an account director, and he came to Edinburgh, and a highly creative agency, Marr Associates, and Colin Marr, the owner, he was an art director. I mean, he had more D&AD awards than anybody else in Scotland by a long chalk. Yeah. But at that time he didn't have a writer, and as you know, the creative team is the art director and the copywriter. Yeah. And so we effectively became his writers, and particularly my colleague, who turned out to be absolute genius, above the line advertising copywriter. Yeah. I was more pedestrian than I did this of brochures and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But so that kept us going. That kept the ship afloat. But the first job I wrote for a whiskey company was for Bell's in 1981. Wow. And purely by chance, during the 80s, I worked on a lot of mainly brochures and brand promotional materials, but the annual reports, all sorts, for probably about 8 or 9 whiskey companies and brands.
And was that partly because you were in Edinburgh, so it made sense, you had that Scottish connection, therefore it was logical that you would also be writing about whiskey?
Yeah, because, the jobs came through mainly design agencies, actually. Right, okay. But a lot of the companies used Edinburgh-based design agencies. Yeah. Glasgow to some extent, London to occasionally. Yeah, yeah. But we were in the right place at the right time. Yeah. And come 88, I used to like to have a book on the back burner, to turn to when the commercial writing was slack. Yeah. And come 88, I didn't have a book on the back burner. I had, by this time, a considerable interest in Scotch whisky, and a track record. And so, and I'd written a number of books, and so I made a proposal to Mitchell Beasley in London for a book about Scotch.
Yeah.
And that was signed up and accepted, and
Wow.
so it was signed up in '88 and published in '93, and and after that it's been whiskey all the way.
Whiskey for the last kind of 30 years,
Yeah,
more than
yeah.
30 straight.
Yeah.
Have you had any 30-year-old whiskies to toast your 3 decades of whiskey writing?
Well, I mean, many more, and I mean, as you know, the whiskey loch of the
Well, I was gonna say,
1980s.
what a time to be starting in whiskey
know.
is when the whiskey industry was in total free fall.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I mean, I was unaware of it, of course, at the time.
Yeah.
But it's only with the wisdom of hindsight that you realise just how powerless the situation was in the 1980s.
Absolutely.
But then, obviously in the right place at the, because it began to pull out in the 90s.
Yeah.
And I was able to help. Obviously I was asked to write many more books, and then I was being used by the industry to do talks and tastings. I did a formal training in sensory evaluation in '92 with Pentland's Scotch Whisky Research, and that changed my life. Really, it did.
Really?
And the opened the whole business of sensory chemistry and so on.
And was that something that grabbed you when it came to whiskey? What was it about whiskey that made you fascinated? Was it the history, the characters, the tasting, the nosing of the spirits?
It's a good question. Scotch whisky sort of brought together. I'm temperamentally an historian, and and Scottish history is my fascination. I've written quite a lot of about it, and and also the sybaritic, the side of things. I enjoy food and drink, and so that. But then also, in the early days of the literary agency, I was doing a lot of work for Canongate publishers, and I found myself for the first time, because my family background was all medical, and but talking to the editor about the commercial side of, because I was writing reports on the manuscripts that they were receiving, and to my amazement, thinking about who's going to buy this, how it's going to sell, blah, blah, blah. So the commercial side for the first time came into my life, and the commercial side of whiskey came into my life necessarily with both the historical research that I was doing and the contemporary, what was the purpose of the break? I mean, as you well known, I'm sure, Alwynne, if you're taking a copywriting brief, a commercial brief, the key thing you've got to know is who's going to read it.
Yes. Who's your audience?
Yeah, and what do they want to know? And so it brought together all these things, but particularly Scotland. I have a great passion for Scotland and the social history of Scotland, the general history of Scotland. But and Scotch just sort of brings the whole thing together. It is so much as I'm sure you'd agree, the spirit of place.
Absolutely. It's very much woven into the culture, into the history, into so much of changes to how people operate, what farmers did,
Exactly.
the land, everything that's kind of so integrated into Scotch whisky, isn't it? So yeah, it's fascinating.
So it was perfect. I mean, it was so. In other words, it was purely by pure luck.
Yeah.
But hey, I'm so glad.
And obviously over that time you've seen a lot of changes to, as you say, you started in the 80s when there was this massive free fall in the Scotch whisky industry, and it's obviously grown exponentially in the last decade, last 15 years. So a lot of changes in Scotch whisky, a lot of changes in world whisky. What would you say are some of the biggest, most influential changes that you've seen, especially over that last kind of 20, 30-year period?
First and foremost is the growth in single malt whisky, because it was beginning in a small way in the 70s, but with the massive overproduction of the late 70s and the closure of many distilleries in 83 and 1885, and the effect of the crisis, fashion had changed. It was all blended Scotch, as you know, in those days, and so the whiskey loch, and then they looked around and they saw that William Grant's Glenfiddich was doing extraordinarily well, and Glenmorangie and Macallan, they were launched to commercially in 1981, and and a few independents were picking up, but by the end of the 80s, there was a steep rise in the number of single malt expressions that you could.
They're actually on the market.
And it was picked up massively by the press, by media, so it became the topic of conversation, because the problem was, as I'm sure you're aware, that the perfect storm was the fact of gross overproduction and a change in fashion.
Yeah.
And
which they couldn't predict when they were making it in the 70s.
That's another interesting aspect of the industry. But so vodka in spirits, vodka and white rum
through the 80s,
began to take, both in America and in the UK, erode the brown spirits market, the whiskey market. And then for global economics, the end of the Vietnam War, the oil crisis in the mid 70s, unanticipated, etc. And so but anyway, the renaissance, the rediscovery of malt whiskey sort of saved the day, in my view. So I think that's probably the single most significant. And then coming through that was coming up and up during the 90s, and then it's gone ballistic in the last 20 years. With these ridiculous prices. But then you see it's a rarity. That while I remember, you see, I don't really like to think of it, but with the crash with the collapse of all the stock markets in 2008, people with money were looking at alternative investments. And by 2017, Knight Frank, in their wealth report, based upon looking at performance at auction of a number of products, rated whiskey, particularly Scotch, some Japanese, but particularly Scotch, at prices achieved at auction as the number one best performing alternative investment. Better than gold, better than fine art, better than motor cars, better than, coins, stamps, The industry's benefited to some extent, but it's somewhat corrupted the industry as well, because it means that the older whiskies are achieving, ridiculous prices. In the old days, if I say old days, and before then, there were collectors and there were consumers. And the prices were manageable. But then when after 2008, these two categories were joined by investors, people with deep pockets, for whom the whiskey was a commodity, and they weren't. Don't get me wrong. Many investors in whiskey, appreciate the whiskey and drink it as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And the other thing, it used to be said that a collector would buy 3 bottles, one to drink, one to share with friends and drink, one for his collection, and one to swap. With others.
Absolutely.
And to some extent, the investors they pursue this as well. But so that's a significant thing.
Were you surprised at how many auction sites have popped up in the last little while? Almost, did that come as a surprise to you to see the kind of plethora?
It did, but that connects with perhaps the third most significant, the social media.
Right. Okay.
Because the whole marketing has now changed. Since the late 90s, social media and this sort of communication and podcasts and so on are so much more important now, and for explaining and for selling whiskey. And to some extent, the messages communicated by brand owners have to be geared to an extent to a better informed market, and to some extent a more demanding market, because they're not going to be the sort of people who are going to buy, especially moderately expensive whiskies. They tend to know an awful lot more than the people did 20 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. You
And
can find that
us writers fed, with books and so on. it increased the knowledge of particularly malt whiskey. But the audience through the internet is much better educated now. Then of course there is the phenomenon, the true phenomenon of the expansion of capacity in the Scotch whisky industry, and indeed the whisky industry global.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was actually what I wanted to follow on with, was you saw the whisky industry through that period of time. Maybe you were not conscious of it. It was happening potentially in the background, but through the 80s. Are you concerned from that expansion, from that capacity perspective?
I was recently updating one of my books, and I'm probably out of date already. The update will appear next month, July.
Yeah.
But it'll be out of date.
Yeah.
But that includes 43 new distilleries since 2004. 43.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And the expansion, the doubling of capacity in some major distilleries like Glenfiddich, for example. And on the back of an envelope, I believe the capacity of the industry has gone up by about 60%.
60%.
Now, the obvious question now, although of course some of those distilleries will be working at full capacity, but many won't.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
but the simple question is, will the market expand by 60%? And the $1 million question. The
multi-million dollar question.
Yeah. And the nature of the industry is changing because many of these new distilleries will have to rely on selling their product as single malt, rather than trading as they
used to. Yeah, absolutely.
For blending. And blended Scotch is still the backbone of the industry, but and so it all, and the other thing is, of course, that in the last few years, I should think less than 10 years, but the price of materials is going up and up and up.
Absolutely.
So yes, I am concerned for some of these new things. But on the upside, because they're having to focus on developing flavour in their single malts.
Yes.
Right. They're looking at all sorts of different yeast varieties, longer fermentations, different wood types, and all sorts of things to create unique selling points. Which expands the range of flavours available to us consumers. And so it's on the one hand it's quite a healthy situation. On the other hand, it is perilous.
Yeah. Wow. So I think as the next probably 10 to 15 years of the Scotch whisky industry is probably going to be quite an interesting space to still be operating in.
Well, I wouldn't be at all surprised if you, like I, am asked by some people, we've got clients who want to buy a distillery, or we've got clients who want to build a distillery. I always say, wait for 5 years.
Give the industry a little time to breathe to see if we've got the capacity to actually.
Exactly. There'll be some on the market.
And would you say, in terms of what's most exciting for the whiskey consumer, you mentioned different yeast strains, different expressions that are coming out. Would you say that's one of the more exciting things from a buying and enjoying perspective for the whiskey consumer? Or what are you seeing in the market right now?
Good question. The obsession of many of these new distilleries is flavour.
Flavour, okay, yeah.
Exploring how flavour is developed in Scotch whisky during production. And I'm talking in terms of barley varieties. I'm talking of lengths of fermentation, distilling techniques.
So things that are at the start of the process rather than cask finishes, which is what we've seen a lot of the more traditional distillers kind of play around with, is use of casks. That's kind of post-production methods. You're talking about during production.
And I think this is quite healthy, because there's been too much talk about the benefit of the influence of the cask. 85% comes to the club. Well, we don't want that. You've got to have a good product, an interesting product. Spirit to start with. So these are all very interesting, and the mantra is that they would sacrifice efficiency and therefore cost to flavour. Fine from the perspective, but somebody's got to pay for it.
I was going to say, where does that cost get passed on to?
That'll be us, the consumer.
Yeah.
You know, so it is a very, very interesting development, and who knows, and indeed, you know, where it'll go. And I mean, it's not only barley variety, and going back to barley, I mean, supremely inefficient barley. Sweet, as we both know, the industry. They say, oh, what barley variety makes no difference in terms of contribution.
We
of
just
flavour.
want to see how much the yield is. Does it give us lots out of that type of barley to produce as much whiskey as we possibly can, rather than does that barley grain give us an interesting flavour profile? Yeah.
And new varieties are being developed every year or every few years, and in the interest of that increasing yield.
Yeah.
But now they're looking at going back to, I mean, remember there was a 1960s variety called Golden Promise, which produced that produced a wonderful oily spirit, and it was very, very popular with distillers and indeed brewers.
Which is why sometimes I think in those older bottlings, if you pick one up from an auction site, super interesting flavour profile, and it's like, how is this that different? Is it bottle aging? No, it was probably a big part of that was actually what they were using in the get-go. Yeah.
But you see, the yield per tonne of barley of Golden Promise was round about, I think, if I remember rightly, about 380 litres pure alcohol per tonne. And of course, now the new varieties are up to 420.
420, yeah,
which is quite a big jump.
It is, yeah. When it sounds small. If we're talking, you know, in the listeners listening to this podcast think, well, what is that extra 40 litres per tonne? But when you're looking at the cost of barley these days, and an extra 40 litres over the long run, if you're making a couple of million litres per annum, that makes a huge difference.
It does a huge difference, and then, you know, I mean. But anyway, it's an exciting development from our, as a consumer, from a consumer's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whether they'll be able to get the product to us, you know, and to sustain the, because you see it'll be reflected in price, and you know, we were talking earlier about distribution. The distribution is a real killer.
Yeah. So you mean getting it to different markets? Exactly,
exactly. Because, you know, the UK market is, some of them just take the small view that, we'll sell it locally. You know? Well, can you run a distillery by just local sales?
Yeah, and if there's 145 distilleries all saying, we'll just sell it locally, the Scots must be increasing their whiskey consumption.
Yeah. And of course, you see, the other thing is that from overseas shops, the whiskey is now being made, in my last count, 87 countries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and I mean, if you're getting it locally, you're getting it made locally as well.
Yeah. Now, I mean, this is another big question. You see, you know, the number of distilleries, mainly quite small in America. There's thousands of them now.
It's unbelievable, the increase.
And I mean, Japan has sort of tripled or whatever the number of distilleries. Ireland has more than tripled.
More than,
And you know, and these are all potential competitors, but certainly competitors for shelf space in any liquor store anywhere in the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Scotch, I think, still has the edge in terms of its tradition and its overall flavour profile. But nevertheless, there's potential. I mean, look at the whiskey made in Taipei in the Cavalan distillery. I mean,
that changed the whole way people thought about world whiskey in terms of what was actually being produced there, and which is, I think, in some ways. Do you think that has helped the Scotch whisky industry to sit up a little bit and say we need to do more, because they've seen over the last decade this proliferation of distilleries in other markets which could be competitors? Or do you think the Scotch whisky industry is still a little bit like, we're fine because we've got this tradition?
I'm afraid I think it's sitting on its hands.
Do you think so? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think, because, you know, we talk rather arrogantly about Scotch and non-Scotch.
Yeah. Scotch and these others.
Yeah. I'm not unduly concerned about the competition, because they're learning, they're feeling their way. You know, I mean, some people. I mean, China has terrific potential. I've done a lot of work in China for Diageo, particularly in the through education. You know, and and it has huge potential. Now, of course, there's now half a dozen or at least large distilleries in China, but many of them are advised by Scottish.
Scottish, as has been the history. I mean, Japanese whiskey. Where is its roots? And
But it would take them some time to catch up. But then you see there are so many imponderables, because it's perfectly possible that the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, impose an import tax on Scotch, and in order to protect
their local market,
like in India. I mean, India's another particularly huge potential market. But it's a hornet's nest, really. It is.
So generally, exciting times and perilous times for the Scotch whisky industry over the next.
It's never dull.
Yeah. Exactly. Looking over, we were talking at the start of this podcast about the fact, your first whiskey book was published more than 30 years ago, and you've had an incredible contribution to the world of whiskey in terms of, from the writing perspective, from many perspectives, but certainly from the writing perspective. Is there one book, if you look back on over the last few decades, that you're most proud of, would you say?
Well, the one that nearly killed me, nearly broke my marriage, was Scotch Whisky: A Liquid History, which was it took 5 years, I think, to research.
Wow.
And and that, obviously I was doing anything that I was paid to do. To say what wasn't full, but it really took an awful long time to research and write.
Yeah.
But I am, it's still, there are many improvements I would make to it, and might not. That was published I think in 2002, something like that.
Okay.
I'm not sure, but it was about then. And but that's probably the one that I'm proudest of. I'm working on a book about blended Scotch at the moment.
Oh, wow, that will be very interesting.
With Hans Offringer, the
Hans,
Dutch, expert.
Yeah.
And that's being during COVID, I was asked to write a monograph about blended Scotch whisky, and I've always been very interested in blended Scotch.
Absolutely.
And it's one of these, it's a subject that's been ignored. There are no substantial books about blended Scotch, and so it was a great pleasure to start researching it. And it was perfectly apparent from after doing this little book that it required more detailed
investigation and treatment,
and illustration, labels and adverts and all that sort of stuff. And Hans has a huge file.
Oh, the marketing of it. I mean, when you look at the marketing of blended whiskey back in the early 1900s, it's fascinating. It was the first brand marketing experiments of of like animated signs in squares, and of stuff that Tommy Dewar was doing back then, and they were just absolutely ahead of their time.
Yeah, they really were
from the marketing perspective. So
it deserves treatment, and and it's been I've been speaking to blenders and looking at such accounts of by other blenders previously, how they approach the theory and practice, if you like, and so the history, theory and practice of blending. There will be a chapter on enjoyment, which will be largely to do with cocktails and things like that. I can't remember now what the rest of the book's about, but that's it'll be
very interesting to look forward to. I look forward to that because, as you say, I think blended Scotch it does get missed out on a little bit in terms of the historical significance of it and the impact it had on the general drinking of whiskey globally and enjoyment of whiskey globally. So wow, look forward to that. You obviously separately are focused on a lot of charity work, including through your own MacLean Foundation, which has raised an extraordinary amount of money for projects globally, especially for clean water projects. It's in Madagascar, which is something
at the moment. I'm very glad you mentioned that. I have 3 boys, and they rode the Atlantic in 2019-20.
Fascinating. I loved following along with that, and it was just incredible.
They broke 3 world records, including fastest. And they were rowing for they were rowing for 2 charities. One was Feedback Madagascar, which, as you say, is clean water projects in Madagascar, and the other was called Children First, which is a Scottish children's charity. And they raised, I think, about $250,000 for the 2 of them. And but that gave them that. The interesting thing is that, on long haul, whether it's by sail or by oar, let alone by oar, long haul voyages, the crew tends to hate each other by the time.
Until you get to your destination.
But the boys, they were very good friends to start with, and they were even better friends. And by the time they finished, and they wanted to continue this, the idea of whiskey for water. Now that because before they did a test row before the Atlantic row. They did a test row out the west coast of Scotland, and I got in touch with, brand owners and distillery owners
on West Coast distilleries,
and begged bottles of whiskey, which I then vatted together and created a blended Scotch and a blended malt, and a blended Scotch, and that was sold for charity for the Feedback Madagascar, and So the idea is that the MacLean Foundation, they set it up, and among the trustees are a number of Nick Morgan, and Annabel Meikle, and so on. So people
figures in the Scotch whisky industry
involved. So the idea is that we will beg casks of whiskey and then bottle them up for and they're sold. Then all the money goes for charity.
Fantastic.
And it won't. Initially, it will be Feedback Madagascar because we know and trust them. But it is the terms of the purposes of the charity are open to. You can imagine. And they have. Well, we've already. I can't tell you. I'd say because the first cask was Ardnamurchan. And that sold out in 3 weeks. And
amazing.
And the next one is on the stocks, but I'm not sure I should say what it is.
So watch the space.
And indeed, the third and fourth have already been offered.
Fantastic news.
And that will come. We're hoping to do about two a year.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, they announced, I think, the BBC was all over it 2 days ago, their plan to row the Pacific 9,000 miles rather than 3,000 miles. And they've commissioned a boat in the Netherlands, state-of-the-art carbon fibre boat, 30-foot rowing boat, and they're planning to sail from Lima in Peru to Sydney, Australia, and they reckon it to be 120 days, something like that. And they're unsupported, of course, as well, and they're at the moment they're planning to row it in a one rather than stop off on the way.
That's incredible. Wow.
And that's entirely separate from the charity, by the way. But it'll promote
the charity.
Yeah,
absolutely. Give people intro into what they're doing and the charity work you're doing from the Whisky Centre, which is amazing. Yeah. Wonderful news. Wow. Well, hopefully they'll still be friends at the end of 120 days.
I hope so.
We'll see. Oh, amazing. You must be so proud of them.
I am proud of them. Yes. I'm somewhat nervous. All the eggs in my basket.
Of course.
They're very, very capable. But a wee boat in the middle of a big ocean.
Yes. Wow. Well, I look forward to hearing more as to when that comes to fruition. And in terms of just looking, I suppose, at the next 10 years, we've spoken a little bit through this podcast about some of the things that consumers might want to look out for that could be exciting, but anything else you feel that is going to be quite key in terms of the development of Scotch whisky, or what we will be seeing over the next kind of 10 years or so?
There are so many imponderables. There are so many things outside of the industry's capability. There's things that we touched on earlier on. Fiscal arrangements, fashion, all kinds of things. Who knows? And it really is impossible to predict what's going on. Now, talking to Charlie over lunchtime today, and he was pointing out the potential danger about there being enough water. Because it's not enough snow melt, and the distillers rely more on snow melt than on rain. And there's a lot of rain in Scotland, but there's not enough snow now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there's all kinds of funny things that might influence. And I'm afraid I couldn't begin to predict. Anyway, I'll be dead before the 10 years is out.
I highly doubt that, Charlie. Definitely not. So in terms of you've had this incredible career in the Scotch whisky industry. I'm sure you've had more memorable moments than you could ever recount. But are there a couple that stand out to you that as a final?
I couldn't. But what I would say is that I feel so lucky to have fallen into it, really by mistake, unplanned. Because as you read, it's a wonderful industry to be involved with.
Absolutely.
So many good people and so much passion, both from all sides, obviously production, consumers. Yeah. And although one gets a bit fed up with marketing people from time to time,
from time to time,
even the best marketing people and dare I say it, management. But it's a terrific industry.
Yeah.
And very supportive and surprising. They compete in the markets, but the production side and you never badmouth a competitor. Mm-hmm. And indeed, in many cases, support.
Yeah.
You and I will both have found that if we want information, they're more than happy to supply.
It's a very open industry, absolutely.
So I'm so pleased, and long may it last.
Absolutely.
But I'm afraid I can't predict what's going to happen.
That's part of the fun, isn't it?
It is.
Oh, well, we can. I would raise a toast, but we'll have a dram afterwards. But,
we certainly will.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Charlie, it's such a pleasure,
it's
always,
been a joy
to have time to speak with you. So thank you so much. I'm sure our listeners will be fascinated by your story. If they didn't know you before, then A, shocking, but B, I hope they go out and buy lots of your books and recognise what an incredible contribution you've made to the Scotch whisky industry. So
thank you so much, Alwynne.
Thank you so much.
I've really enjoyed our talk.
Wonderful. Yeah. Me as well. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to the latest edition of the VCL Vintners podcast. We will be back with another episode and another guest very soon. Cheers.